On account of being British. I think I probably am in the minority here. Not often the 33-year-old white man who lives in the country in which he was born is a minority in the room, but there you go, it's the first time. I ought to start by thanking, obviously, the hosts, so Bright Purple, and in particular Nick, I'm sure many of you know. So I actually only met Nick a few weeks ago, through a mutual friend, through Paul, in fact, and we were talking about his idea, Nick's idea for this event. And I said it sounded very interesting, and so I agreed to do whatever it is technically that I'm doing, hosting, chairing, not quite sure what the right word is, but here I am. And that was before any promise of drinks breaks were made or anything like that. Motivation, two main things that motivated me. First of all, probably like other people in the room, some of you, I was kind of fed up with the way that Brexit was being presented and staged and almost kind of performed every night on television. Even at events around the university and conferences that I kind of have to go to as part of my day job, you find yourself getting increasingly bored with these constant panels. On the one hand this, on the other hand that, let's get the Remainer, let's get the Brexit. Watch others try to sort of accurately predict the future. This will happen with the deal, this won't happen with the deal. And in politics, prediction has always been a fool's game, and never so more than it is at the moment. So I was kind of excited by the prospect of something a little bit different, which still took Brexit as its kind of cue, but that's much more about everyday lived experiences of people here in Scotland. Second motivation as is described in Italian words rather than English words. Nationals, obviously a fiance and in-laws to be who are EU27 nationals, and I kind of see the impact that this process is having on them. I've heard occasional stories from them of abusive language on the streets, on trains, and supermarkets. Palpable sense of anguish about what the future might actually hold for them here in the UK. So there's a professional interest in being here, but there's also kind of a deeper, much more personal interest. So to get things going, what I thought I'd start by doing is offer up some thoughts really no more than kind of prompts for discussion. Although being an academic, I probably will talk for longer than I realise I am talking. I actually have a clock running here, but academics are notorious for going over time. They always think they're the most interesting person in the room. They never want to stop. And feel free to challenge anything I say. Feel free to ignore anything that I say. Feel free to raise your own prompts. That's kind of the whole point of the evening. I think the way we've got this structured, and Nick, tell me if I'm saying anything wrong, the first session will run for an hour or so, and then we have a break, and then we come back, and we'll have a series of 2 guests who will talk about their experiences post the EU referendum. So I can move my slides on. Trying to coordinate my hands here. So the first guest that we'll have, Mikhail Iwanowski, who came across some graffiti in Cardiff that said "Go home Polish," and took that prompt very literally indeed, walking for 105 days, I think, more than 105 days, from his house in Cardiff to the village in Poland where he was born. And that's been widely covered in the UK press, a fantastic story, and we'll be able to hear from him a little bit later on this evening. And the second Manchester. So after hearing their thoughts, we'll then open up for another broader discussion after that. So I wanted to start with a story relayed by a friend of mine, one of my EU27 national friends. She's a German journalist who lives and works here in Scotland. She has done for many years now. Over a decade, I think she's been here. It was an encounter that she had on a train in Scotland, like this one, and she was talking in a noticeably German, or to the non-discerning ear, foreign accent. And somebody on the train asked her what her plans were now that she would have to leave the UK. And this was within a week or two of the EU referendum, so this was summer 2016. Now, when my friend sort of retells this story, that she didn't really detect any malice in the person who was asking that question. It wasn't coming from a particularly nasty place on that occasion. It was coming from a misunderstanding, a curiosity, but nevertheless it created this tremendous sense of discomfort, this feeling of unsettledness, when hopefully, what we're trying to create amongst EU27 nationals in the country is a feeling of settledness as opposed to unsettledness. And I think that's a story, sadly, that could be repeated, I suspect, hundreds, probably thousands of times by people up and down the UK. As I say, when my friend didn't detect any particular malice, sadly, in many of the reported cases that we've had since the referendum, there is a discernible malice in some of these cases and some of these occurrences. The reality is that a large number of people, still a minority of those who voted for Brexit, but a large number of them, did feel that things would change rapidly and almost immediately after they cast their vote. They thought that people would have to leave the country. They thought deportations were where we were going to end up. Not the majority of people who voted for Brexit, not all of them, but a sizable minority. And these sentiments kind of start to show up in incidents and encounters that have been pretty widely reported in the couple of years, 2.5 years now since that vote. And they're not isolated incidents, despite what some people try to suggest. So The Guardian, albeit a paper coming from a certain perspective, admittedly, that this Guardian have been cataloguing incidents such as this since early 2017, so for about a year and a half, more than a year and a half now. And there have been repeated incidents of the examples they've been identifying, job adverts that clearly specify that those applying must have British passports, which would exclude many EU27 nationals illegally. It's not currently legal to exclude people on those grounds, and hopefully it won't become legal. Job adverts that say things like the candidate must have the right to stay and work permanently in the UK and a valid passport. But beyond the job market, there have been reported incidents of rental properties being advertised for UK citizens only, or for having different terms for renting properties for EU27 nationals than for UK citizens. Again, not legal. You can't do that, which doesn't mean that people don't. Again, it may come down to misunderstandings. But these things are happening. And then there are some truly more ludicrous examples. They're not funny, there's nothing humorous about them, but they are just ludicrous. A 41-year-old German woman who'd lived in the UK since 1998, who was refused a test drive at a car dealership in Stockport because their driving licence was European and, quote, due to Brexit, no longer valid. Another woman, 48, from Greece, who'd lived in Edinburgh for 25 years, reported that she couldn't apply for a financing plan to buy furniture because she didn't have a British passport. So from the truly ridiculous examples, truly ludicrous examples, but they are happening. And the 3 million campaign group, which some of you may be familiar with, they've helped compile the most recent dossier on this, and they sum it up, I think, quite well. They say discrimination is subtle and often hard to prove, but the examples we've seen are only the tip of the iceberg. So there's so many of these individual stories, we may well hear more of them this evening. And if we look at the bigger picture, we can start to see a narrative emerging. So I don't want to imply any direct causality in anything that we're about to say. As I always tell students at the university on public policy and politics courses, politics and public policy are a bloody mess and fundamentally resistant to modelling and cause and effect type reasoning. But what we can do is take a look at some data and start to build a more or less convincing picture or a narrative of what might be going on. So 2016, just months after the... Actually, come back to that in a minute. That's not one you want to leave up there while you're not referencing it because it's a really ugly slide. 2016 is just months after the referendum. The United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination said that many prominent politicians should share the blame in the UK for the outbreak of xenophobia against ethnic minorities. And in the week immediately before and the week immediately after the referendum, so this fortnight period around the referendum, there were more than 3,000 reported allegations of hate crimes, which was just astronomically higher than it would have been, weeks earlier, a year earlier. Now, for some, the Daily Mail ran a headline, "The Great Brexit Hate Crime Myth." This didn't feel right. They didn't think that this was true. They thought the figures were being misread, although the Daily Mail isn't really the place you go for facts necessarily. A heavy dose of feeling, but not maybe so much on the fact side. Although we do seem to live in a political climate where feelings trump facts, no pun intended, really quite frequently. Now, of course, focus in events like a referendum will have effects on things like reported hate crimes. It's a terrible thing to say, but you do expect to see spikes in reported incidents of hate crimes around these kind of political focusing events, heightened political moments. And it's researchers, not at Edinburgh, to plug a different university, Southampton, who've looked into this, I think, in the best way. They've got a really rich set of Home Office data which identifies this clear spike in reported hate crimes after the referendum. The referendum is the dotted line here, and that's daily incidences over the better part of 2 years, daily reported incidents of hate crimes, and that's what happened after the referendum. It kind of shoots up. If you're wondering what the spike towards the end there is, that was on the back of a series of terrorist attacks. So Finsbury Park Mosque, London Bridge, Westminster, Manchester. So again, you see these politically focusing events to have an impact on how everyday citizens behave and interact with other people who live in their country. And even beyond that, incidents of hate crimes have actually been drifting upwards for years now, which is, as I say, it's disgusting, it's not something we welcome. But there's also something to be said about we are reporting and recording them in a better way, so we're recording more incidents than we would have done in the past. But even beyond all of those effects, this is what social scientists would call a statistically significant effect, controlling for all sorts of different things. We can say pretty much for certain that what was going on politically around the referendum has a direct relationship to this massive increase in reported incidents of hate crimes. Once you do all sorts of fancy statistical controls, which I'm not going to... That yawn was perfectly cued when I said statistical controls. It was almost like I'd asked somebody to do it. It was spot on. Now, what data like this doesn't tell us, though, of course, is it doesn't tell us why. It doesn't tell us why people might behave in this way, talking to other people on the streets in the way that they are, hurling abuse, etc., etc. But there are potential clues in another branch of research that correlates public opinion with coverage of things in the media and the incidence of hate crimes. And what we can see here is the same group of researchers from Southampton. What those three lines are correlating together is the number of articles in UK national newspapers which contain the word immigrant, migrant, that's the dotted line here. The salience of immigration as reported by the public. So to what extent do the public say that immigration is a really, really important issue? That's the solid line. And then the number of hate crimes, again, which is this dashed line. And what you can see is that they all come together around the point of the referendum, which is this line down the middle again. The reported importance of immigration to people in the country goes up quite significantly on the run-up to the referendum. The number of newspaper articles covering immigration, and usually covering it negatively, goes up as we get towards the referendum. So these two things kind of plot together.
Can I just quickly ask, are these data from your own research, or is it from somewhere else?
This is
and
from,
if so, from where is it?
This is a team of researchers at the University of Southampton, and they've used the data that underlies it is Home Office data that's been released on hate crimes. And then the data that lies behind that line, the dark line, will be just sort of public attitude surveys. So when Ipsos or YouGov do a poll on these things, and they ask people, rank the most important issues facing the country, immigration, health, whatever. So they'll be pulling data from several different sources. But if you want the actual full sort of report, the working paper, I can get you the link if you want to read it in full.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah. No, sure. Sorry. So we know that coverage of immigration in the campaign grew, in the referendum campaign. It grew. It became this dominant issue. Other researchers have looked at over 350,000 individual news articles during the referendum campaign, and they've concluded that coverage of immigration became more negative, often was linked to problems and pressures on public services during that referendum campaign. The majority of the negative coverage in places like the Mail, the Sun, the Express, which probably doesn't surprise us, but the Mail and the Sun are still the highest circulation papers in the country, so they do have cut through and they do have impact. And the overall tone of news coverage during the referendum, particularly around immigration, was acrimonious, it was divisive, it was highly partisan, and that of course has its impact on political trust that people have in government and indeed in each other. We remember posters like this, right, which we think of as the sort of epitome of the worst side of the referendum, but these images matter. And we see from the survey data that attitudes and the degree to which people think immigration is the biggest issue facing the country, it shifts on the back of moments like this, especially when you get a lot of media coverage of it and this enters the kind of popular narrative. I'm not going to leave that up for a while because I can't stand the sight of it. So I'm going to get Nigel for, it goes from bad to worse. I forgot I put that one in there. We'll go back to Nigel. Now, when I talk to colleagues at Edinburgh in the sociology, kind of social psychology area, what they say, and I think this sounds plausible, it sounds credible to me, is what the referendum did is it made people feel all of a sudden like they were part of a silent majority, particularly people who cast votes for, people who cast votes to leave the EU. Even up to the point of the referendum, there was still kind of a stigma around saying certain things about immigration and migration. You would immediately be called a racist, a xenophobe. But all of a sudden, after this big focusing event, you're one of the 52%. And if you think the 52% voted for the same reasons that you did, i.e. all about immigration, which not everybody did, not all of the leavers were just obsessed with immigration. But if you can read those preferences into those other 52%, all of a sudden you've gone from being voiceless to being part of the silent majority. And what was acceptable the day before, what was acceptable to say to people on the street or in the supermarket the day before, changes. And all of a sudden, we see similar phenomena like this. What is now acceptable political discourse in the US, because if the president says it, then, and if he wins and millions of people vote for him and share his views, maybe it is acceptable to speak in this way and to make publicly racist and xenophobic statements. I think there's certainly something to that. So it's this kind of us versus them mindset which seems to have come about and seems to have hardened a little bit, particularly so in England. We can talk maybe a little bit about differences between England and Scotland as we go on through the evening, but particularly in England, this attitude of us versus them seems to have hardened, and it's particularly amongst people who identify as English. It's particularly people in the UK who say, I'm English, not British. And it's a remarkable number of people in England when you actually say to them, do you identify as English and British? The number of people who only report an English identity, they don't even consider themselves British, has been on the rise significantly. So for lots of people in England, the us versus them isn't just even us British, them European, it's us English and them everybody else, including everybody else in the UK. So the English question in British politics is a really major one which really hasn't been addressed yet and probably will need to be going forward. Now, what's the effect of all this? Coming towards the end, I promise. What's the end? The net effect of all this? Well, we know from the Office of National Statistics, we know that this Brexodus, that's the phrase that's being used. It's a terrible phrase, but the Brexodus of EU nationals leaving the country We have seen falling levels of net migration since the referendum result came in 2016. A 6-year low net migration to the UK from other European Union countries. And for the first time since 2004, there's more people from the 8 Central and Eastern European countries leaving the UK to go home than there is coming in. It's 45,000 coming in last year, 47,000 going home. That's the first time that flow has ever been in that direction in 14 years. So all of this negativity, all of this public discourse, it does seem to be having an effect on a fairly mass scale. These are huge shifts in migration patterns in just a few years, really, really big shifts. Which of course then has further knock-on effects in the economy. We all know, particularly here at a recruitment agency, we see more and more people reporting that they're struggling to fill vacancies in the economy, and particular pinch points in the health, social care sectors, agriculture, and so on and so forth, the tourism and the service industry. So all of these effects sort of compounding on each other, and we're now facing a fairly significant economic problem. We may not have enough people to come in and actually work and keep the economy going and keep it productive. And I would link this directly to the kind of image that Britain is sort of putting out there about itself at the moment. But that's the people who are leaving. What about the people who aren't leaving? What about the people who want to stay? And the people who want to stay, of course, are going to have to navigate their way through this application process to become settled status people in the United Kingdom. People are going to apply for settled status. And the Prime Minister has said, it'll all work wonderfully and it'll be seamless, and you don't have to pay £65. I mean, that's all you have to do, right? They're so generous. It's charging people £65 for the honour of being allowed to stay in the country that they already live in, and they're contributing to it in a meaningful way. Sorry?
I said that's cheap.
It's cheap, okay, well it's half price for kids. It's £32.50.
It's like 800 quid for Americans.
Oh, it's 800 quid for Americans. Well, how gracious of the government then, in that case. The EU 27, you should all feel very special. And I think a lot of the uncertainty that's bound up around this, and a lot of people's discomfort around this settled status plan, is tied up with kind of two things, one of which I'll just very briefly, the other one which is, I would say, maybe a little bit more important. The one I'll just talk about briefly is we aren't even certain if this is going to happen yet, because we don't know how the negotiations are going to pan out between now and January. But I don't want to talk about that directly, because that gets us into that predicting the future again, and I already said that's a fool's errand, so I don't want to make myself the fool. But I think the issue that's more relevant, that's causing issues around this, is it's just back to trust. People do not trust the government to handle this process well. And I think partially that's a trust issue to do with the fact that the government is led by a Home Secretary who was part of the hostile environment campaign. But it's also on a more fundamental level when we talk about implementing something this complicated. When was the last time the British government implemented anything well that required an IT system and working at scale? I mean, we see this with universal credit at the moment, we see it with all sorts of things. So I can understand this sense of unease, driven both by the governments, not just the British government, lots of governments struggle to roll out IT projects and administrative projects well. But then that broader context, you can't separate this process from the broader tone of British government migration and immigration policy. So we have to wait to see how this plays out. But that's obviously for the people who decide to stay here. And lots of very vulnerable people will have to go through this process. People who are digitally excluded. It's a largely online or telephone-based process. People who face higher language barriers. People who don't have bank accounts, who tend to work more cash in hand. They will have problems going through this system. So it'll once again be the more vulnerable EU 27 nationals who really struggle. There was a great column in the FT about this process, and without a hint of irony, the columnist in the Financial Times said, well, this all seems very complicated, but I've consulted my citizenship lawyer. Now you're thinking, okay. Without a hint of irony, he's consulted his citizenship lawyer, and his citizenship lawyer had said, oh, don't worry, it'll all be very straightforward. Of course, most people can't afford to have citizenship lawyers, but columnists in the Financial Times can. So the intention of the settled, I'm in the wrong job, I should work for the Financial Times. The intention of this settled status project seems to me broadly right, but the implementation and that broader policy context that it's being introduced in are causing concern. Now, let me finish, I do mean finish this time, with a slightly more provocative comment, but it's only a slightly provocative comment, because academics don't really do provocative. And it's back to anecdotes, which is where I started. I started with a friend telling me a story about experience on the train. So back to an anecdote. I note that many of my EU 27 friends are actually quite vocal proponents of somehow stopping Brexit or reversing it. And I was having a conversation with one of them just a few days ago, and they were coming, I think, rightly from the perspective of, well, what's going to be best for me and my rights, and as I go on and live in the UK in future years. And we were thinking about what would be the best thing, and we came to the conclusion that actually the smooth and negotiated Brexit with the transition period that Theresa May is trying for, that's actually the best of a very risky set of prospects at the moment. We both agreed that the prospect of a very harmonious reversal of Brexit, where the country just says, okay, we changed our mind, not going to do it, and there's no fallout from that, was virtually impossible to imagine. What we could imagine were two alternatives: a collapse of the talks entirely and a no-deal Brexit, in which case the situation for EU27 nationals gets more uncertain than it is already. Or, secondly, a very charged and a very angry reversal of Brexit, with genuine, serious protests on the street from the 52% who think they've just been robbed, that would actually stoke that nasty undertone within certain sections of public opinion even more than it already is. So we came to the conclusion that really the lesser evil here is to back the Prime Minister and support her in what she's doing and hope she pulls off a miracle deal. So we would say that was the lesser evil. But that might just be a very depressing way of thinking about it. Right, that's enough from me. I want to open this up now to discussions. The kind of broad prompt that I had was, you know, when you talk about Brexit every day, what aspects of the debate don't you like? Why? What aspects of the debate do you like? I was also interested in some of the things, these were just some prompts for discussion. Is anyone actively participating at the moment in campaigns or movements to either try and reverse Brexit or possibly part of that 3 million campaign? It'd be interesting to hear from anyone who's got inside sort of experience on that. Do you feel like anyone's defending your interests as EU27 nationals? If not the government, is there anyone that you kind of look to at the moment and think, well, okay, at least they're on my side, at least there's the possibility that they might win this argument? And then what about friends and family back home? How are the conversations that are going? My fiancé is constantly having to justify the British government to his family at the moment. They keep saying to him, why is your country, why is your government doing these things? And he almost becomes the spokesperson for the British government, which he'd rather not do, for sure. So these are just some of the prompts and thoughts for discussion, but I'm keen to get, you know, more thoughts from the floor. Will everyone get picked up on the microphone? Do we know if that will work? I think
everybody can.
Everyone will get.
Yeah, everybody can hear.
So yeah, I mean, let's just have either directly relevant to this or the things I've just mentioned at the end. Experiences, thoughts, stories, yeah.
Okay.
And maybe if you say your name and sort of what brought you back to the event tonight, just so that we know who you are.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. My name is Joanna Sabacka. I'm Polish. I lived here for a number of years, and I'm involved in a number of different campaigns and citizens, grassroots organising initiatives. So I'm part of the 3 Million, the Scottish branch, and I'm also organising a series of events across Scotland to inform EU citizens about Brexit, and that's as part of EU Citizens' Rights Project. So we have been funded by the European Commission and now the Scottish Government to go around the country and to ask people what their needs are and what their concerns are, and just generally to get the feeling of what can we as a lobbying group lobby for the Scottish Government. And with the 3 million, I think for Scotland there are, we have to consider different things. So there is a couple of options that we are considering. We are just about to launch a campaign with the M25. It's a movement to democratise Europe and to take a break from Brexit. What we're hoping for is to mobilise the European community and to kind of think in a different way about the whole process. We think that it's very much rushed, and this decision doesn't have to be made very soon. So we are campaigning for extending the Article 50, and we are hoping for this kind of more informed approach to Brexit, which we don't feel that it's currently happening. There is another campaign as well called the People's Vote, but it might not work for Scotland because Scotland already voted to remain in the European Union. So if it will vote again against the Brexit deal, that might not be considered. What is the main concern of EU citizens is exactly what you talked about, is the vulnerable group of the citizens that will become undocumented migrants. There is lack of trust to Theresa May with obviously recent scandal with Windrush generation, and that's another kind of thing to consider. Our rights are not ring-fenced in any way at the moment, and I know I rattle a little bit, but I think that this is only the expression of the sort of uncertainty and kind of trying to organize a migrant grassroots movement to fight back. I don't think we wanted to be ever in this situation. I don't think we ever expected to be in this situation. Last time I was here, it was a meeting about participating in European Parliament elections, and it was the last elections. Nobody suspected that we're going to be leaving the European Union and that we would have to have these kind of problem to deal with on a daily basis, because it affects not only our daily life but also our mental health and our decisions whether to have a cat, have a mortgage, or and move away and live in another country. Yeah, sorry for rambling, but there's like loads of different ideas that I was trying to.
Less rambling than me. So that's great. Can I just ask you a follow-up? How are you finding, if you can tell us, I mean, if you can say, obviously the Scottish Government working on this. I mean, obviously a lot of politics tied up in this for the Scottish Government as well, but they seem to be coming, as you say, from a different place than the UK government.
They do, but there is a little bit of power struggle as well, because Scottish Government says, well, we've not created this situation. So if we are asking for funding for supporting, and actually even for a plan of how the support will be organised for citizens in Scotland, Scottish Government is like, well, this is something that we've not accounted for, so we don't have funding for, and so there's, should we devolve immigration, like, should we, so there is a little bit of this kind of power struggle and political push and pull from both sides, and as much as I really appreciate Scottish Government's support to our projects and that they are very open to discuss things, I think we need more practical support because there are things that Scottish Government can do and they choose not to do it, or they don't know how to do it, or there is this political battle that is happening. And this is what is very concerning, because at the receiving end, we are still very concerned.
Yeah, a few more rounds to go in the UK-Scottish Government battles, I think. There's not any end to them on the horizon. Anybody else in response to that, or just not in response to anything? It's been said so far.
I can say some words. Hi, I'll stand up. My name is Johan. I've been here for almost 25 years. Come from Sweden once upon a time. Been fortunate enough to live around the world, US, Asia, Germany and so on, with and without families. If we have this, Brexit's going to happen, right? It's not going to be a second referendum. That's the bottom line. And what will happen with us? That's a good question. Recently, I play football every Sunday with some boys, or boys my age. Some I call them boys. We are white middle-class people. We come from different various European Union, actually, plus some English. Sorry to say, they are the key factor in this. And they are living up here, and they don't like foreign people. And you would think if you're a white middle-class person, you wouldn't have an issue with judgments or issue with pointers, why you're still here, why you're not left yet, right? That's the racist part of it. Then you have the ignorance or the lack of knowledge. I think British people, maybe I should reframe them, English people have. My mother-in-law, she lives in a village, Campbelltown, X amount of miles away from here. If you ever know where it is, West Coast, road finish. She voted Brexit, leave. And I said, why? Well, two things. NHS, very emotional. Immigration, very emotional. So that's a problem. And I said, why? In your town, you can call your doctor any time you want to. You have one Polish family. What's the problem? Yeah, but you see, the people in England may have a problem. That is the lack of knowledge and the emotion that the people who sold Brexit actually sold to these people. And that's a problem for us. For me personally, yes, I'm married to a Scottish woman. That's the reason why I'm here. Don't want to live in this country anymore. Good question. That is the biggest question I deal with myself. Really, sometimes I don't think so. Hmm? Do they want me? Probably. I pay taxes, I have an income. Yeah? But do I want them? Or do I need them? Hmm? That is a question we have to ask ourselves. You see, here to form a life, to be living here and have this constant kind of battle with some people who doesn't really want you here. You have to make that judgment eventually. And I Nick Magita knows my family, and I asked him a question: do I really want that? I live here. I do nothing in the UK. My business in Europe, and in Africa, and in Asia. I really don't need to be living in the UK. So I can go somewhere else. But then the problem is my family, which is mixed race, I call them. But they're white. Mixed race is to be black and white, but they are mixed race. So that is the fundamental issue, I think. Do you want to stay if nobody wants you to be here? Or do you just leave, and then we'll have a problem?
My father will be disappointed to hear that there's definitely going to be no reversal of Brexit because he's out every weekend on some march or other. So he's keeping the faith. He's keeping the. Yeah, I mean, I think no. I agree with you. I think it's highly unlikely. But
highly likely. But even if Labour comes in,
yeah.
Or Tory continue, there will not be another referendum.
No. Well, Jeremy Corbyn's spent the better part of his political career campaigning against the European Union.
Yeah, so he's going to leave anyway. So there you go.
Yeah, so I'm Serge from Sweden, and just wanted to add to your opinion. I was here for about 13 years, and first I felt as well like I'm not welcome here, and just I couldn't find a place really for myself. But so as anywhere else I would go, and I stayed in Belgium, Germany, and it's like anywhere you go, you go back home and you feel the same really, I think it's all about finding a community where you contributing to, you contribute something to the community, and then you will feel welcome in the community. So if you have business in Africa or other countries, it would be very hard to find a community over here because you contribute to other places. So in your unique case, it would be probably different to other people's case, but I think Brexit, second referendum, well, we've seen before in many countries, like just recently in Spain, there was a referendum, and yet the referendum was overturned by politics here. Although I think that we live in a more democratic world, and we have more chance of fair referendums here, but I do believe that it's possible. It's hard, but it's possible. But I was working and doing something. I was talking to one of the bloggers for S&P, and so they're looking at two scenarios, either doing a second referendum or doing a referendum for Scotland, second referendum for Scotland. And my company was developing a special tool that we don't want to take, although to be honest with you, I don't actually know what side I'm on. Because I came from a country that broke off of a bigger country, and it's not going to be easy either way. I mean, to me it's better to stay where we are and try to make the best out of it. But since it's happening, and as you said, it's most likely will be irreversible. Like I was supporting recently a movement on change.org, and it was about young people who turned to voting age after the referendum, yet they didn't have the chance to say. So and lots of other groups and minorities, so people who actually I think should have a chance to say. And I don't think it's a one-person decision. I think it's fair that all people have to say, but I think that many people just had no chance of fair information or enough information gets into them. That's why we developed this tool that it's basically a very simple tool, but anyone who wants to support, they can basically install it in their browser, and the tool basically will use your social media profile, your friends and your pages and groups, and it will spread information both sides of the story, but it will spread more widely and obviously free.
What's it called? Sorry, maybe I missed it.
Yeah, well, it's gogohuman.com is our website, but the tool is Human AI.
Human AI.
Yeah, we don't have a website for that,
Sounds
but don't have much information about this, kind of a little bit secret yet.
Okay. And it's about
Sounds secretive.
encouraging like more informed
More
approach.
information to, just encouraging for people to learn, encouraging people to learn and just to
And
hear more.
Kind of balancing out in a sense, because we know now that you can just retreat it effectively into a bubble, and if you follow people on Twitter and you follow people who've got the same views as you, you're just constantly getting things reinforced. So is this an attempt to kind of try and balance that out a little bit?
I felt like the mainstream media, I mean mainstream television was more pro-BREXIT, and at the same time I felt like on the internet there was more against BREXIT, but lots of information for older people who maybe don't use social media as much. They would be missed out in lots of information, and it would be possible to reach them using that tool, because even though they maybe don't use social media often, but using that tool we could get their contact details, and then we could contact, that tool can contact them through email or SMS.
Okay. Anybody on this particular topic, news and balance and getting news increasingly through various forms of social media is obviously big expanded areas of concern that people have.
I personally think it's very toxic, and we're all guilty of confirmation biases, so we're all going to look for things that reinforce our beliefs. So for me personally, the choice would be not to go to the social media to get my news, do my own research. Politics is all about emotions, about feelings. Politicians always play on people's fear of loss of jobs, of security, or money, and so on. So if you want people to vote on facts, you need to encourage them to go and find their own facts and find their own information, and not be fed by Facebook and all of that. As we know, is all fake media. There's algorithms. They go out there and pick 5,000, things about you, and like Cambridge Analytica, we know they had for each American 5,000 factors about that person, how they're going to vote, and targeted them with those news. So personally, I think we should all just go and find information in the old-fashioned way, reading, finding articles that are not funded or supported by a particular government. Just go away from Google, just go to the traditional.
Loads of the traditional media, not only in the UK but other parts of Europe as well, are super biased. And like I have, most of my colleagues are Scottish, and they get their news from not even the worst newspapers you cited, but moderate ones. But still, they had what they told me. What's in there? I don't read that stuff, but it's incredible. And
I personally think we should be more proactive, not be fed. I think we should go and look for things like podcasts, where the discussions aren't funded by, some newspaper or some government or some sort of party or something like that. Go and look for things that, are not tinted and they're not influenced. Podcasts, you can educate yourself with them. They're not feeding you that information. It's just my opinion. I think we're all being brainwashed, and the news that is out there, we all know is not necessarily true news. So, my personal opinion is that we should all go and look for information rather than be fed this information.
But this is a conscious effort. So
how
do you make people to think that this is important, and how you empower them to do it, because I think there is this whole sense of powerlessness, and that what can I do? You know, I couldn't vote in the referendum. Nobody's listening to me. You know, how can I influence the debate? And you know, activists are trying to encourage people to join campaigns, sign letters, sign petitions, and so
There's a
on.
massive disillusion with democracy. We've all been let down. There is no faith, there is no belief in something anymore, and there's the reason why there's such an increase in nationalism. That's why we're out of Europe, because there is a massive disappointment with how the system, this is the most successful political environment we'll ever had, but it's still not good. It's failed. But what's the alternative? Do you want to go to communism? Do you want to go to fascism? Do you want to go to liberalism? So it is the fact that everybody's disillusioned. So how do you give people hope? It's about giving people hope in something new.
Well,
I personally think in a global political government, or in a global, our issues are global, they're not national, so we should all look at solutions globally.
I think it's
Who is it? I
teaching
can't see who it is.
people how to
Oh,
do
at the back,
research,
sorry, yeah.
you know. So, as you said, we'll get articles, so lots of people don't just know where to go, lots of people don't have interest in doing so. So it's a long process of educating people and being more active in political arena, and as well educating them about doing research and how to do the research. Me personally, I always cross-check in 5-6 different sources. Well, if I have time again, recently I've not been doing it very often, but if I do so, I tend to go through many sources to cross-verify the information.
Well, this is conscious effort. You want to do that research, but most of voters, they will be lazy and they will listen to a breakfast show where Nigel Farage will say, this is how much money we will get if we leave the European Union and we'll stop migration. And this is the lazy option where you know that this is the information that I get, and I'll vote because that information is in my head true because I heard it on TV, rather than conscious effort of sourcing 3 different areas where you can research quality information which will be non-biased, probably won't be towards Brexiters or people that won't know. So that's the conscious effort that you want to make, but not everyone, most of the people I would say will not.
No, they don't. I mean, I can say from the even students who have, the students who come to university, presumably come to study politics. I have 200 of them sit in front of me every week. They won't read.
No.
And they don't have anything else to do, ostensibly, at least on paper. They don't have anything else to do, and so many of them won't read. They won't read articles. They won't. They do get things from social media, but they don't sort of have this inquisitive sort of desire to try and find the information. They want you to tell them exactly what to read. Read this. Read these 3 things. Read these 2 things. And it's kind of problematic, but I think I just want to pull a couple of threads together because it's all hitting on the same things. In terms of education, and taking it almost back to first principles, and particularly around civic education, that's something that the research shows up again and again and again, which is, that's where it starts. You teach people about the system that they live in, you teach people to understand the political system that they live in. The levels of knowledge in the UK about the European Union are woeful. They're just, even now, even after the referendum, which was a farcical referendum, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. The levels of knowledge are just outrageously poor compared to our other, our colleagues, our co-citizens in the other EU 27 states. They know a lot more about how the European Parliament works, what the European Commission, the basics at least. We don't know anything at all, which of course makes people more susceptible to it's a terrible empire, it's trying to take over the country, it won't let us sell prawn cocktail crisps and whatever piece of nonsense. Boris Johnson made a big deal about the prawn cocktail crisps because it's got too much sugar in them to be sold as crisps. Anyway, so I think a proper civic education programme so that people understand, children go to school in the UK, understand the British Constitution, how it sits within a European framework, or sadly won't probably in the future, is really, really important. It's a kind of civic education, and that will increase, I think, more of that desire for knowledge, more of that appetite for knowledge. The other thing, though, in terms of people being able to get knowledge is it takes people a while to click into issues. I mean, I think the biggest sort of travesty of the EU referendum was it was so fast, it was so rushed, it lasted for weeks. Now if you look at the Scottish referendum, which lasted for the better part of a couple of years, from when the firing gun was started to when we voted, if you look at public attitudes and if you look at levels of public knowledge as measured, not in polls, but in proper surveys, at the beginning of that 2-year period in the Scottish independence referendum, it was really poor. People didn't really know very much about the constitutional settlement, and they didn't really know what the relationship between the UK and Scotland was. They didn't know very much about what Westminster could do in Scotland versus what the Scottish Parliament could do. 2 years later, after a proper national conversation, levels of knowledge were just tremendous. They were through the roof. You could go on, I'm sure some of you remember this, you'd go on Wednesday, Thursday nights to events, 7 o'clock at night, people have done a full day work, and they're there, full of energy, talking about the impact of the oil price on the Scottish economy after independence, and you're like, hallelujah, this is incredible. That didn't happen in the EU referendum because there wasn't any time. So you could get away with slapping £350 million of the NHS on the side of a bus because people didn't have time to digest and process and click into the to the narratives and say, actually, that's bullshit. That's not true. I don't think you could have done something that egregious in the second year of the Scottish independence referendum because people would have just said, that's bullshit. We know that's not true. We've been debating this for a year at a fairly high level. So you've got to give it time, and we didn't in this case. We didn't give it any time.
Can I just chip in and say with my very English main voice, I might add, we have Mike Russell, MSP, who is charged with looking after Brexit-related issues in Scotland, in this very room about 6 weeks ago. He frankly, and there are some people that were here, and you can put me right if you interpret differently, indeed, gave an impression that he thought it might not happen still. But there was a room full of people, largely from technology, business leaders of a level, dominant, who sat here, and there was an air for me of expectancy that he was going to tell them what it meant that we voted for Brexit. And the travesty for me is that, with all respect to the layman in the street, these were largely business leaders, and were saying, what did we vote for? And that's after the event, which backs up what you're saying significantly, and I think that's quite a difficult situation that we're now having to deal with, but one that's not insignificant, particularly when I would suspect that most business leaders employ people from the EU and value that. That's certainly my experience.
Any, well, again, reactions to that are generally, we've got a couple minutes, then we're going to wrap up this first bit, take a brief break, and, but, yeah. No? Can't do it in a minute sooner? Is that a long comment?
I just wanted to, just one point I wanted to make around, I'm sorry if I'm talking too much, but around independence referendum, because I remember participating in these events and having debates with people, and that was all amazing. And I remember one of the arguments for no campaign was you need to vote against Scottish independence because otherwise your rights as EU citizens are in danger. And so a lot of EU citizens voted against independence even though they felt they wanted independence for Scotland. And then, 2 years after that, there was a huge disappointment because the Brexit referendum wasn't even at that time, well, it was discussed, but it was unreal to happen. So, so I just wanted to make a point that, probably, considering the levels of migration and the number of EU citizens living in Scotland, independence referendum would have a different result if we weren't encouraged to vote against it.
Yeah. No, you're right, it wasn't. I mean, it was on the table in 2014, some notion of an EU referendum, but not if Cameron was saying, if I get a majority, no one thought he would. It's kind of, in a sense, almost the great accident of contemporary British history. This isn't supposed to be happening. David Cameron wasn't supposed to win a general election in 2015, still not quite sure how he did it. Maybe if Ed Miliband knew how to eat a bacon sandwich better, it would have all been different. Maybe that's the contingency of British history, is Ed Miliband can't eat the bacon sandwich. If he had, it would have all been different.
Seems to be an ongoing theme, though.
Well, bacon sandwiches.
You could be sitting in Spain and have the referendum there. You could be sitting in America and listen to Trump and Hillary. You could be sitting down in South America. It's an ongoing trend. When it comes to community, I kind of stopped listening to the news
Yeah.
because it gets you in that chaos, that negative loop, and it says that you're this person from here and you're trash, or you're this person from here and you're this. I've started doing better just by going out and saying, everybody, we're all on this planet together. We are all born inherently good. You know, the only thing that separates us is, I guess, values. What is it? You know, I'm an American. I was born an American. Would I put my ego aside for everybody else? Sure I would. I would invite people into my house and have a discussion, an open discussion of what would help. If I could help, I would. But you know, we're falling into these segregated groups, and once you call yourself English, or you call yourself Scottish, or you call yourself Spanish, or you call yourself this, you automatically put a border up. It's the individual. It's how you get across and talk to and communicate to other people. So I think it's more than just politics. It's a deep-rooted community issue, as you said. You want to be around the people you want to be around that make you feel good.
And sadly, for a lot of people in England, and hopefully it will change, that's exactly what they want, but through wanting that, they voted for Brexit.
Yeah,
It's coming from the same sentiment. They want people who, some of them, not all of them. I'm English. I'm not trashing everyone in England, and not everyone in England voted for Brexit, but a majority of them did. And that rise of Englishness. I mean, I'm agreeing with you. That rise of English identity and that prominence of English identity. There is a real problem, particularly in England, with that, because it is a very little Englander type mentality. It's
We're falling into the same trap.
Yeah, Scotland's doing the same
If
thing,
we're
yeah.
doing that, and if we're calling them, racist, we're falling into the same trap. We're as bad as they are. I think, we need to look at this. We're all human. We all have the same problems regardless of borders. We should all work together and not say, I'm English. Racism is out, but cultural, racism is in. Like Trump has said, some shithole countries in Sri Lanka, it's not about you're black, you're white. It's about you are inferior to me as a nation. So we need to try and work together and prove we're not inferior. Just the fact that I come from Romania doesn't mean that I am less intelligent or less knowledgeable or than somebody that comes from England and so on. And I personally don't think we should say English are nationalists, because there are a lot of Germans that are nationalists. There's a lot of Americans that are nationalists. There's a lot of Spanish that are nationalists.
no, but what you can say and what you have to say is, if you want to solve the problem, you've got to start by understanding it. And one of the problems in certain sections of citizens in England, British citizens who live in England, is that they are having an increasingly strong tendency to identify as English, and that then goes along with all sorts of other attitudes towards immigration, towards things like our relationship with the European Union. So there's kind of no point saying, well, we wish they didn't think like that. You've got to start by understanding why they do think like that, and then trying to figure out how you change their mind, not by just sort of wishing it away. But you need me to wrap for now, and we can come back in a few minutes. Okay.
We're just going to take a quick break, and by the way, thanks for all your input, because it's obviously been a good start. Because we've got Michael waiting on a Skype call in Cardiff, we want to get him on, and Zakia as well. So Zakia is also going to take to the front, so we're just going to get a quick break. If we can just cut you down to 10 minutes, get a drink, get a bathroom, I just read your post, so Karina, you're the one that's worried about what happens after you graduate, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. Dan, got a pick on the stone today, who's worried about graduating, but no, in all seriousness, let's get 10 minutes, get a break, and then we'll get Skype up and we'll get them in. Thank you very much so far, yeah? Yes, Karina, we're looking forward to you. You saw your yeah, but it's a really comment.
Moje identitet. Sverige känns
Yeah. Because you understand all the guys. that, he's going to see the room. So what we need to do is do that, and guess what you need to do is say hello when we once we bring it up, yeah, once we call it. So and Zakia obviously is also going to be involved. So do we get Zakia up at the same time? I think you should. I think you should take your seat as well. Everybody's at the front. Remember, Jenny, some questions from the back, please. Don't let all these Estonians and Romanians hug all the questions, you know. Right. So, shall we call him?
Yeah. Doing that.
Shall
I can
stand-
probably do it from here, can I?
You can do it from there if you
I
dial
haven't
it.
used Skype for ages. It's video call, isn't
Yeah,
it?
it is.
Yeah.
Well, we hope it is.
We hope so. Let's see.
You're going to have to.
Oh,
Ah, there we are.
So I need to be.
You need to be kind of here.
Okay.
Michael,
Oh, no sound.
sound.
Can you
Ah, can you hear? Hang on a second. Wait a minute. Wait a minute, Michael. How are we doing, Mark? Try that, Michael.
Can't hear.
Can't hear. Wait a minute. Can't hear you. Wait a minute.
Hang on, just to your own sound at the bottom.
No, it's not that one.
Oh, I'll try.
Oh yeah, it's ours, Mark. Yeah, it's us. Yeah, quick. Hit it. Yeah.
54%.
Mark, do you want to do it? Hang on, Michael. It's us.
Just in the sign language.
Aha! Up to the top. Right.
No.
We can see you talking though.
Wow. It is sign language. Wait a minute. We're working, are we?
Yeah, I think it might be his. Just ask him if he can hear us to nod or to wave. He said it might be on his side.
Ask him if he can hear us.
Yeah, wait a minute.
There we go. That should be it.
Oh,
Hey!
Well done, sir.
Okay, okay.
Good evening.
Good evening. How you doing?
I can hear it casting aspersions. It's him.
By the way, oh, we've lost it. That was a Swedish person that did that. So, you know, the Swedes are always doing that, Michael, yeah? Hey, Michael, I'm Nick.
Hello, hey, we got Swedes in the room.
Yeah, we've got Swedes, we've got all kinds of nationalities. We've got Poles as well. So, yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah. And here's Dan, who's going to talk to you.
Hi.
So I'm going to leave you to it.
Okay, great, thanks. I'm trying to figure out where to stand, so...
Just sit here, I think.
Just sit here, okay, that'll work. Okay, we can't see you. So, hi, we've got two panelists, so we've got yourself, but we've also got, well, we'll do introductions in a second, but you can't see the second panelist. You can't, yeah. So, just bear in mind that there's two, and we'll sort of go back and forwards after we've done introductions. The voice that's coming from off camera is your co-panelist. So, would you like to start and just sort of introduce yourself to the room and maybe explain how you've come to be talking to us this evening, and then we'll sort of open for some questions and discussion.
Yeah, sure. Nick got in touch with me after this article in The Guardian published like a month ago, I think, when Shona Hagen wrote about my project Go Home Polish. I'm a photographer, live in Wales, and I have for 17 years now, and I'm just did this walk from Cardiff to Poland, asking people where home was, and I did a photo project about this, and that's how I'm speaking to you guys, and I'm very happy and privileged. So, good evening.
Good to have you, yeah, thank you. And then, sorry, and now the voice from off camera, sorry.
The voice from the
voice
side.
from off camera.
I've been living in Scotland for 10 years. This is my 10th anniversary. We actually did a big party in August, but I 2 years ago created a social enterprise that I now run full-time, supporting homeless people in Scotland and across the UK. and I have worked with homeless people for the good part of 8 years, mostly in the UK as well, so that's probably why Nick asked me to speak as well, as a EU citizen contributing to social impact in this country.
Okay, well, good to have you as well.
Thank
Thank you
you.
both. So, I mean, obviously, you weren't with us for the first hour of the discussion, so don't worry, I'm not going to go through all of it and summarise. People behind me will start to groan. But there was a lot of, there were discussions about sort of general feelings that people sort of have at the moment in the UK, EU 27 nationals who live here, the kind of uncertainty, the kind of everyday experiences that they're having, which maybe aren't great, to put it mildly. And I was just wondering if you had any kind of anything that you wanted to share beyond obviously what prompted your walk, which we've seen in the news. And since you've returned, do you get the sense that things are much the same? Has anything changed? Anything gotten better? Or
Well, you know what? I live in a bubble, which is a big problem for me because I'm surrounded by liberals and like-minded people, so I never really experience any xenophobia. I never get any. I mean, the only one time I got really abused in a street was by Polish people in Cardiff. So this is very difficult for me to be talking about Brexit in terms of personal experience, but there definitely is a huge disillusionment among my British friends mostly, and I mean, of course, lots of my EU friends, some Polish, some from different parts, they kind of left it, and they haven't acted upon, getting the PR cards or getting the citizenship because they're kind of like hoping for the best. But a couple of my friends who see our life quite seriously in Britain, and we want to invest in it. We did this thing a couple of years ago when we just did the application form and got the citizenship. But I think at the moment I'm just surrounded by this low. It's like calm before storm. I guess before March, it's a bit of a low.
yeah. So I would just
I think I find it quite ironic, I think, sometimes in my situation. So I have a foreign sounding name, even for a French person. Definitely not a French name, and I have never felt as French as I have in Scotland after moving. So my father's from Algeria, my mother's from France. So in France, I heard the "you're not French" chat quite a lot. I still hear it today. And it's something that really saddened me because I feel nothing but French. And here in the UK, I work in a sector where I'm also a minority, being a woman, so I represent the UK. Yeah, like yesterday I went to an event for the top 100 women in social enterprise in the UK, and I was on that list, and I'm French. Or, people working in social impact, or whatever you want to call it, and I go to international events, and I don't go as a French person, but I go as somebody representing Scotland or the UK. So it's very ironic all the time, and it makes for a very confusing kind of environment. And sometimes it makes me think, oh, but what am I? What should I say when I introduce myself? Should I say that I'm French, or should I say? So it's quite it's been a funny last few months and last couple of years.
So just to go back, you were saying a second ago that you did I hear this correct? You were saying that you abuse. So did you say from Polish people on the streets of Cardiff? Did I hear that correct? Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you explain that slightly? What you mean by that? Because I'm like.
I was working with a friend of mine, and it was a few years back. It was actually just like a year after we joined the union, and some Polish guys called us faggots. Just really amazing because I mean, of course, I didn't have a problem with being one, but because I escaped Poland because of those reasons. I escaped Poland because of lack of social flexibility. It was very interesting that it caught up with me very soon in Britain, and I don't have a problem with my identity in terms of being either British or Polish. I don't care about either, to be honest with you. I see myself as something a little bit wider, as a person beyond administration. And I guess I'm talking from a place of privilege, and I understand this because I'm a white male with 2 passports, and I can be talking these things quite easily, But I understand that this is, I mean, for me, it was was a goal to be at this place, and I decided to get to this place so I don't have to explain myself in terms of like, who are you? Because I feel like I'm too old to be explaining this. But many of my friends, and I still do this, I'm very confused when people ask you, so where are you really from? But really, I say, well, from Cardiff. No, but really. No, it's like way back from Africa, I guess.
Getting lots of nods I can hear behind me to that question, where are you really from, or where are you originally from? Is that another one that often gets it? But what you were saying just a second ago as well about you I think your words were you live in a bit of a, did you say a liberal bubble, or it was words to that effect? I may be slightly paraphrasing you. Now, just to be slightly devil's advocate, is that part of the problem? People being in their bubbles generally, I mean, and how do you break those bubbles down?
Yeah, of course. I mean, if you, but my job is not to stay in the bubble. That's why I'm doing this project. I'm showing my face in Wales online as this Polish immigrant. I'm going into these places that I wouldn't normally vector, because this is something that I wanted to achieve with this project: reconciliation. Of course, I'm not naive to think that I'm going to change Britain, but you change Britain by one person at a time. Somebody sees you and he thinks, well, this guy's not an asshole, actually he's quite alright, maybe I should listen, and that's why I listen. I mean, my landlord, who's a nice guy, he voted to leave, and we had these conversations. I don't think he's a bad person, but it's very problematic for me, because I think, well, you're very happy, that this scampy Polish living here and paying rent, but reconciliation is a process, and it's not pleasant and it's not fun, but it's one person at a time. So that's why I feel like I want to leave this bubble of mine. I mean, I love it, but yeah, it's not gonna do much good, is it?
I mean, that's very optimistic, and it's good. It's good. I mean, I don't know about. I mean, do you feel similarly optimistic? I mean, from your kind of experiences, people that you work with here in Scotland, do you share this sense of optimism that we'll have a reconciliation process?
I don't know, but I think somebody mentioned earlier the lack of information and the lack of knowledge, and that's definitely the case with the people that I work with. When the results came in, a lot of folk that we would support through the organisation said, yeah, that's right, everybody should leave, and the moment you say, okay, so that's me, you want me to go, they were like, oh, no, not you. And you're like, but you're French, yeah, but you're not, no, but I don't understand how that works out. All of a sudden, a lot of people anyway, had no information, voted for something, and then realised that, again, it had real life consequences. So I think, and that's working with maybe like what we were saying earlier, people who are disadvantaged in terms of not accessing computers, or maybe literally, not having great English or literacy skills, or whatever it may be, and yet vote and feel like they have a voice, but their voice is wronged from the start, if they don't have the right information. So I think that burst quite. But I think in an optimistic way, I also applied for jobs last year, and to all of the interviews that I went to, everybody was saying, we don't care where you're from, we just want good people, and when the time comes, then we will deal with that. And it was such a concern for me to say, should I say that I only have a French passport and that I've never bothered to actually do anything about it? But all the answers were actually, no, we don't believe in that, we believe in people as people, and we want you for your skills. If you're ever going to get this job, then you don't have to worry about that. So that was a quite refreshing thing, and that was a really positive thing. So, but maybe it was part of the liberal bubble as well. Working in the social enterprise sector, charity sector, you're more likely to be with people like that too.
Yeah. Sorry, Mikhail, I didn't know if you wanted to come back.
I was just trying to say, this is the personal perspective that changes everything. When people say to you, immigrants have to go, but you can stay. That's why becoming visible as an immigrant is very important, because people befriend you, people who would not normally befriend you, but suddenly they know that this language has got consequences, and those decisions have consequences. And I have had people who were suddenly thinking, oh, wow, well, I didn't actually realize that we would also be part of the truck driving back to Poland, So I think what you were saying is very important. That's how you kind of inform people, by just being visible. visible and just speaking up.
I mean, those interactions and those sort of interpersonal relationships that build up. I mean, even at like the macro level, we know that that's true. One of the most incredible stats that I saw about the referendum was if you correlate the number of migrants in an area with the tendency of that area to vote to leave the EU, it's almost a completely inverse line. And what I mean by that is the fewer migrants there are in an area, the more likely that area is to vote to leave, and the more likely it is to have anti-immigrant attitudes. And in areas where there are more migrants, more highly concentrated, attitudes are better towards migrants, or more positive towards migrants, and they were more likely to be Remain constituencies. So people voting against things that they don't really know. They're voting against an unknown, and they don't have lots of people in their area, in their town, in their village. They might think they do, and they might think that they're creating all of these pressures, but the numbers don't bear it out, and it's this real foreignness. And what you're saying, both of you, I think, about breaking those barriers down and being visible, I think, is got to be part of the answer. I've got my back to the room, which isn't going to work, I've just realised, because we want people in the room to ask questions. So I'm going to have to move, and I'm going to be off camera too, because I want people to be able to ask questions of both of our guests. So, I mean, does anybody have anything that, or just share thoughts? Doesn't have to be questions. Questions are good, but.
Can you ask a question regarding your social enterprise?
Yeah.
Where did it start?
Where did it start? So I used to work with organisations like The Big Issue, Street Papers, but also the Homeless World Cup, street soccer
Where did it
programmes.
start for you?
Yeah, so it started in Scotland, and part of my job at the Homeless World Cup was to look at what other countries were doing supporting homeless people across the world. And I worked in Greece for a little while, and in Greece the street paper so you would have a vendor selling you a magazine, but he could also give you a tour of Athens. And I thought, this is great. So I did all of the tours and came back to Scotland and thought, I'll tell The Big Issue that they should do the same thing. And The Big Issue was like, yeah, it's great, but we can't do it because we don't have any money, we don't have any staff. Just if the kind of common answer was, if you go and do it, we'll support you, but we can't do it ourselves. And it never was something that I wanted to create as its own thing, but I thought it's making the invisible visible. It's the same issues we have with homeless people. We don't know any homeless people. Before working with homeless people, I had never had a chat for more than 2 seconds with somebody who was on the streets. And if you had asked me to describe somebody who was homeless, I probably would have told you a guy with a beard and a bottle or something like that. But I realized that because we don't have those conversations, we don't create connection, then sometimes we have misconceptions, and as a result, stigma or negative feelings around it. And if we found a way to change that, then at least we can make our own opinions. We could be informed and decide, whether we want to interact with them, and using the cities as an excuse to visit them, because we all visit them. I love traveling. I visited loads of cities. I thought was a great way. So this is where it all came from, to kind of create a meaningful conversation. And even the name of the company, Invisible Cities.
Because even foreign homeless people can do it.
Yeah, everybody can do it.
For the national tourists.
And I think it goes back to what you were saying earlier of we need to be more visible from that end as well. So it's really empowering for people who have had issues in the past to say, yes, it is me, or it was me. These were the issues that I faced, but these issues do not define who I am. And I think we don't do that work anyway, a lot of the time with people. And there's a sense of shame, or a sense of, we have a big debate around the world, the word homeless. Should we call homeless people, or I tend to say, as somebody who's worked in the sector, somebody who's been affected by homelessness, as opposed to say a homeless person. But I think it doesn't matter. If homeless is what happened to you, it is in you. But because there still is this stigma, charities and organizations still spend a lot of time thinking about that. And I think it's again that empowerment of saying, yes, I am, or yes, I was in that situation, and it doesn't make me less of a person like being Romanian doesn't make you less of a person than being British, you know, or whatever else. So I
Yeah.
think that's what we do through our tours, and through events and through everything that we do and training. And for some people it's just being empowered and having a voice and never doing a tour, and for some others it is. So
That's
Question for
amazing.
Michael.
Yep.
Yeah. So Michael, it's Nick.
He's off camera too.
I'm
Does he?
off camera.
No,
and
Everybody
that,
can
Michael,
see
that's a good
anybody.
thing. Michael, that's a good thing, by the way. I'm off camera. But Michael, Edinburgh. I mean, I think I told you when we were talking. You know, I mean, I was born in Wales, and you know, and I was down in Wales obviously a couple of weeks ago when I came across your story, and you know, I was completely saddened by, you know, hearing about, you know, stuff being written on walls about Poles go home. You know, I work with an incredible Polish guy, Pavel. He's in the room somewhere. You know, and this academy has hosted the Professional Polish Business Society. You know, we're big supporters. In Edinburgh, we've got, you know, the statue of Wojciech the Bear in Princes Street Garden. You know, and you know, and I'm a massive Wojciech fan, I can tell you. And we're just about to open another. We're just about to build another statue of another Polish legend, basically, in Edinburgh. And it's amazing, isn't it, when you think that, you know, you think of, you know, why we've had such a tight relationship with Poland, and you know, we fought together in the wars. You know, we kind of helped each other, you know, defeat, you know, evil, and then we kind of live in peace and harmony. And it comes back again to education, doesn't it? Because, you know, you're seeing stuff written on a wall by somebody who obviously doesn't understand what Poland and Britain means. You know, in respect of a relationship that we've had for so long. Yet somebody obviously isn't educated enough and thinks it's okay to dub, you know, terrible graffiti on a wall. I mean, it's back to education, isn't it?
Of course it is. I mean, you know, the thing is that dogs bark at the moon, and this is the right. You know, dogs do it, and that's fine. And I think we always hear this. The loudest voices you always hear them the loudest. There's millions of positive voices. So I would say that. I mean, this is the problem with the media, that we have this machinery that propagates, uses umbrella terms like immigrants, you know, or EU rats, or, you know, Polish, or Romanian, or whatever, you know, big terms that actually dehumanize the person. And education, I think, definitely something that will be dealing with at least some of these problems. People I met after the referendum, and they said they had no idea what they were doing. I mean, to a point where they had to Google, you know, what EU was. And when I said, they said, "Oh, I want to get my rights back." And I said, "Which particular rights?" As well, you know, those ones, you know. No idea, like absolutely no idea what they're doing. And I think this is the problem with, you know, with education. But again, it boils down to the bubble, you know, because, you know, I'm sure we all agree on the same thing, and there's a bunch of people sitting in this room, and there's many rooms like this, and people agree and know. But then you hear the one or two voices. Like, I don't see many of those in Cardiff. That was the only one, and I saw it in 2008. That's why it stuck with me, really. But if you go online, of course, you find a lot, like, especially in London and other parts.
Any follow-up on that, or did you want to comment on that issue as well?
yeah, I think education is and history, we were talking about this a bit earlier, I think for me is crucial, and I see it in France at the moment with maybe some, you know, racism or some issues. France has a lot of issues dealing with its own history of especially Northern Africa and the children of people that maybe moved to France. But I think it's also how we do education. In school, I never learnt about how people came from Northern Africa to France, so I never really I never thought that history mattered. I was never taught that it had consequences today, you know, in how I would see myself as an individual, how others would see me, and the same, like you were saying, between Britain and Poland. If we taught children that those things are real today, a bit like you say, why do I have to learn all of this, you know, or how we, you know, colonized for France as well, you know, all these countries and what it means for them today, or what it means to France. If you ask, there was a great survey of, if you ask kids to point at France on a map, they will, so the mainland, they will point, but less than 10% will point any of the islands, or, and they don't know that this is France. And people there vote for the elections, you know, and they say, but what, that one, they're a bit black, two, they live in South America, so how are they? And nobody understands that link, and that's because we don't, I think, maybe do education in a way that matters most or more.
And I think our history could, well, I went to school in England. I didn't go through the Scottish system, so anyone who's been through the Scottish system, it may be wonderful, maybe much better than the English system, I don't know. But in the English system, I remember when I studied history, and I studied history to 18, given what I then went on to study at university, I kind of had to. And the British history, Empire, World War II, and the Tudors, of all things. So I knew that we beat Hitler and that we were kind of better than the rest of Europe because we won that war. I knew that we had a really awesome empire once, but I was never really told what was bad about it. We sort of civilized, we built railroads and we brought civilization, and I knew that Henry VIII had 6 wives. I mean, that was it. That was British history as I learnt it in an English school. It may be different in Scotland, but anyway, sorry.
Not really, we learned about Braveheart and stuff like that.
And actually, and it's the one thing that the politicians never seem to get round to it. Every now and then a political party says, well, we should look at the curriculum, we should look at the history curriculum, we should look at the civic education curriculum, but they never really tackle it. The last time the British government did it in any significant way was when Michael Gove was the education secretary, and the historian that he brought in to advise on revising the British history curriculum was Neil Ferguson, who wrote a book which basically apologised for and said that the British Empire was just a great thing, and if it wasn't for the British Empire, India wouldn't have developed as quickly as it did, and we brought railways. That was the guy who was brought in last time the British government took a really, strong look at the history curriculum.
Yeah.
And then we'll collect 2 comments, and then we'll go back to our.
Okay, sorry. But I mean, well, what I'm going to say is the problem with whatever subject in question, whether it be Brexit, immigration, Trump, or Scottish independence, is that it is inherently emotional, in essence. So my question to you guys is, how do we create a discourse, an international discourse, that is inherently neutral?
But I don't think you can, because you have people have emotions, and they have families, and they have histories, and all of that is linked to emotions. So I don't think you can have a discourse on history or on the facts that is more neutral. Those are things that happened, or that they are things that today happen in the way we treat people. Or I spent a bit of time on Lesbos Island in volunteering in the camp, and when I came back to the UK, I didn't want to do any events around what I thought about it, or what how we treat migrants and people who come and refugees and all of that. All I wanted to do was to tell people what I saw and what the situations were. I think if you give the facts, then people can consciously make a decision with their emotions, but at least they will be given the facts. But I don't think you can otherwise.
You can't just, and then yes, and then we will. But let's just go back to you, Carl, and then we'll come back to them.
In my case, it worked exactly that way. The fact that the common denominator was that we all feel similar feelings about those issues. So by bringing us all to the very personal, individual level, the common denominator actually builds amazing bridges. Like, I've walked for 105 days, and I've met a lot of people, and I haven't met one person who was not open to conversation and not relating to what I was telling them, even though we were at different camps. So I think by just actually humanizing this very, very experience, there's a chance that people relate to that. That's my experience.
Who was just about to say? I know you had your hand up, but someone seemed to be wanting in on that particular point.
No, I just wanted to make a personal comment that I am personally optimistic because I think millennials are more aware of the issues and the world that we have created for them, and I think they are eager to change and to save this planet that we all coexist on. And I see a lot of my teenage son, the things that he wants to do to help. And I think the existential problems that we all are exposed to, as nuclear threat and technological unemployment and environmental damage, I think those are things that us as humans have to sort out. We have to become united to sort those bigger issues rather than get caught in the individual emotions, because we're not going to change this. I think we all need to come together and try and solve the big issues which will affect us all if we don't get our humanity sorted.
But empathy, right? I think if we feel empathy for other people, that's how you feel like, okay, let's do this together, because we're on this piece of rock spinning through space, and we have really big problems. You say massive problems as a group of the species. But I think the empathy comes from understanding that another person is as equal, as unimportant, and as no piece of dirt as you are. And then I think from that point you can start thinking about the bigger picture. That's my experience from it.
So you were 2 questions back, so I'm queuing people in my head slowly.
I
But
think you diversed, since the last questions. I don't know if you.
okay, so can we? If this is a direct, then
Yeah,
we'll come back to you. I
exactly.
won't forget you. I promise I
no.
won't forget you. Sorry.
No, just because I'm very surprised of what is said. My experience is absolutely different in many aspects. France, obviously, I'm French. My accent is. I like to say what you're saying is very, personally, I think it's very good. The problem is, it's very, like most of things, very egocentric. You know why the new German extreme right wing has won? It's exactly for the argument you give as good argument for them is the way they manage to collect these new extreme right wing, even we say it's exactly what Hitler was saying about these kind of people who understand the world, feel comfortable everywhere, don't feel the roots and things like that. Then we need to have a discourse which took this aspect in some way. My problem, listening to you, maybe you are too educated in some way. You don't understand that there are lots of different layers in the society. Each of them needs a different discourse, by the way. And emotion, obviously, we know from very long time how to deal with that. That's why so many people are biased and completely manipulated. The question is, how could we reverse that? Again, it's very specific. There is no general answer, by the way. Every country, personally, my wife also, which is Scottish, we have lived in most of the country in Europe. And we create industry, we create companies. Here, mathematicians, the best in the world. And we have people coming from all the world here. That's why we are maybe a bit more optimistic, because we work with the government, Scottish government, and they need us if there is no something we can deal. And now we work on immigration and so on, because they know that tomorrow the power is knowledge, mostly, I'm sorry to say that, for scientific knowledge, intelligent info, augmented intelligence and so on, robotics, and I heard people saying the government are going to change. Yes, a lot. That's why we don't care, in fact, what people have as emotion. The world is changing in 20 years, maybe dying also.
The problem
But,
is not.
Hold on.
But
Sorry.
the question
Yeah, just a second.
is
Yeah.
more to see that, I would say maybe as experience in Europe, here it's the most against foreigners, the most racist, I mean England, but Scotland. For instance, another thing is,
Last thing
because
for now,
my
and then we can
accent,
come back to you,
I
but last
can
thing for now.
leave that everywhere, but we have lost already people working in the company because their partners were frequently asked in Scotland, in Edinburgh, you have a strange accent, why are you still there? I said, Brexit, why are you staying there? And some are already leaving. I have left. And especially one of the most beautiful mathematicians I had, by the way. Then that I'm not going to forgive. But just to say that the problem is everywhere. And maybe if you, on the contrary, to understand what could we, well, first of all, certainly working with governments in some way, helping them to have more courage, trying to push out stupid ones, there are lots of them, and but citizens are very important, and making that understood everywhere. How many times I've heard, even in my company, young researcher with doctor in mathematics saying, oh, we don't know, we have it was so obvious democracy. I don't thought, despite everybody saying they are intelligent, no, they are not so intelligent. We don't know, we need to vote because it's obvious. No, it's not obvious, we see that everywhere. Then it's just, on the contrary, how could we in some way not consider that just her view, but other view, and why they are emotional against what is important. Why not? Because
I need to,
the
I want to bring the
media
panel
are
back. Turn
very
into,
biased.
just slightly turn into a monologue. Just slightly turn into a monologue. I don't want to, but I, you know, we've got. I want to bring the panel back in on that point. And then I've got 2 hands now at the back, 3 hands now at the back. But I want the panel to just come back on that if they have anything. You may not have anything, but I don't want to forget our panelists either. So, do either of you on the back of that have anything? Do you want to jump in on that, or that's a no? It's a shake of the head no off camera, but. It's a no from Macau. Okay, great, right. So you've still, but yeah, do you want to come in at this point? Yes, great, yes, go for it.
And it was mainly for you because as you can, I guess you can hear, I'm also French, and I totally related on the point that you made about education, about people not being aware and having the knowledge of, you know, other communities being French and so on and so on. But for me, personally, I would like to share, you know, why basically I came to this event is I left France 5 years ago to come to Scotland. I absolutely fell in love with the country. Never felt more safe in Scotland compared to France. You know, in France I've been mugged 3 times. Here I always feel safe. I feel safe as you said, as a minority, as a woman. You know, I feel like if there is. You know, I feel protected, I feel safe, I love my job, and so on and so on. When the BREXIT issue came up, I never thought, although working here, paying taxes here, I always thought, what kind of say do I have in the matter, since I'm not British? You know, I was thinking if we leave, it's going to be a shame, because probably I'll encounter issues, I'll probably have more paperwork to do. But I'm lucky enough to have a job where I absolutely do not feel threatened whatsoever, you know, about having to leave the UK, you know, like, and it's just like, do not start picking on me, but from my point of view, I always thought, what kind of say do I have since I'm not British? And I always thought, you know, no matter what obstacles I have to face, you know, I will face them because I love this country and I'll do anything to stay there, you know. So this is my point of view, and it really echoed when you talk about education, because I don't feel like I'm badly educated. I just maybe I'm not informed well enough about politics, but as I was telling my Swedish friends over there, just now, I don't feel the impacts on day-to-day basis of what the BREXIT is going to bring. I'm working in an office where people are from all over the world. We've got, you know, I've got colleagues which are Austrian, English, Scottish, Italian. You know, it's a really vast panel, and just now nobody seems to feel the consequences. So. This is what I wanted to share with you. Like, I don't feel stressed about Brexit, although I heard about, you know, the anecdotes you told earlier about, you know, the horrible anecdotes which are happening of people being, you know, I see that more, you know, no more Polish vermins. I feel this is more a racism issue as opposed as a Brexit issue.
Yeah.
That's it.
Nick, you're trying to catch my eye. Although the gentleman next to you had your hand up too, but Nick, I thought you were trying to catch my eye.
No, it's fine.
No? Okay. Yeah, no, sorry, obviously I don't know your name, I apologise, but you had your hand up a minute ago.
Well, good evening. Well, I am from Catalonia, Barcelona. Well, I have been in 15M a few years ago in Plaza Catalunya. We're talking about democracy, we're talking about real change of politics. Well, My feeling was after the 50M was changed the politics of Catalonia, everything, because the right wing want to focus, don't want to focus just in change the democracy or change the rights of the citizens. They want to talk about the independence, talk about the, well, change the focus. Well, I think Brexit is not the same, but I think it's still the same, because real things happen here in Europe. Absolutely, it's a big mess. Europe, we need to improve. Never is this is the perfect democracy. No, never, because we are making rules for refugees. Well, talking refugees, for citizens from war. I think Brexit don't want to talk about that. They want to talk about their own country, like a imperium. Well, this is my feeling. This is try to focus, change the focus of the real problem. And well, and also another thing, the education, of course, is very important. In Catalonia, we have well, the education. You can talk with everything, and the people speak well and speak and try to think about, explain things about what's happened with, for example, independence, because I am near from that. But I think the real problem is not just only education. I think we need to don't be comfortable. Means when, for example, we read a newspaper, we don't need believe what we are reading. We need to compare with another newspaper or another source.
Yeah. So you need to be more, think more critically about these things, engage more critically. I'll come across and then just check. I'm checking back with the panel again. Again, I want you're here to inspire us with thoughts. So I'm just kidding. No pressure. But do either of you want to come back on any of the comments we've had over the past 5-10 minutes, or are you just happy listeners at the moment?
I think we all agree on personal experience being different in different places, and I totally relate to that. I feel a lot safer and in Scotland than I do feel at home, and in the south of France. So, and same, I think day to day, there's no different. I started the company 2 years ago, so I left a full-time job 6 months ago. So if anything, I put myself more at risk than anything, but that's because it feels safe, and I have no. Day to day you might not see it, but I think what we can do is like going back to what you were saying earlier, putting ourselves as example and saying this is who we are and this is what we do and this is what we try to do for this country. There was a really great quote that I saw by one of the MSPs who, I may not agree with everything, I can't remember, he was saying, I can't remember his name, but he was saying where you're from is interesting as who you are as a person, but it's not, it doesn't matter. If you're here, then you're one of us. And I think if we all spread this and we all live by this, then that's how we'll make the difference. I think we're all the same here, no matter where we came from 10 years ago.
Mikhail, just anything, or do you want to chip in there? Or?
I think it's interesting actually, the nature of the question, what you're from. I used to take it very I'm not defensive, when somebody asks you where you're from, it's almost like you're saying you don't belong here, so where did you come from? But actually I started recently thinking that this is a very British thing to ask anywhere. Like I work in care homes with people living with dementia, and I just observe them every day, and that's the first question you ask somebody, your neighbor, so where are you from? And even the Welsh from a different village, this question is part of almost like a social code of communication. It doesn't need to be an aggressive question. which is something that I think we were saying about this MEP, that it isn't questioning you as a person necessarily, and I think accepting it for myself was quite a nice liberating thing to do. Yeah, I just get the view of the tip of his shoulder.
You had your hand up, but then there was a voice in the audience as well, so I will go and then we'll come back across, yes.
Yeah, Angela. A couple of things. I mean, it's bizarre because we had this Scottish referendum which was quite divisive, if all of you lived through it. But actually at the same time, and I'm Scottish, but I'm the Scots-Italian, right? So married to the Frenchman. Lived 22 years in Germany, France, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, but we do have, and it's Alan Smith is the MEP for Edinburgh, who's written a whole, if you sign up to his weekly newsletter, it's very gratifying, he gives you the view from around. But we also have Ben McPherson, who has just become, and I'm not, it's just that they're the party that's sort of in power in Scotland at the moment, and so great. But they are actually using their voice, and as a Scot, we happened to be in France the day when the Scottish government announced, and Ben was behind this because he's now he's the Minister for Europe and Immigration, and we have a meeting with him actually on Thursday to talk about immigration and the needs for Scotland, because we stepped up as a company. We said, we can't just sit in the background worrying about whether we'll get staff. We actually want to contribute, and we wrote a paper along with our visa guy to put input, so you can take part in this and input, and they're looking for inputs. But one of the things that we actually happened to be in France, and I read this out to across, there were other nationalities there, and I said, look what the Scottish government has just announced, and it was the announcement that if you have done us the supreme honour of making Scotland your home, then you are Scottish. And and we will make sure that post-Brexit you have the right to vote, and we will take care of you. And I have to say, I could barely finish the sentence because I've managed to get over it now, but I found it actually a leadership position which could fly in the face because, you're Scottish and it's not British. But I think it's probably what Westminster, some of the sensible people that are in Westminster are needing is some kind of leadership. And I think to get behind that, and it's, Nick will know, I was very proactive in this sort of Keep Scotland British campaign in 2014, but I actually find I can get behind this agenda because it is shining a light, it's holding a torch, and amidst all of this rampant imperialism, which is abhorrent, and rampant nationalism, which I think has raised its head and been unleashed for the first time in other parts of the UK. But I think that is very empowering. And by the way, there is also the police force. If you ever suffer any racism of that kind, someone telling you to go home, there is an entire campaign where you can quietly text and sort of say, I'm suffering, and the transport police, because we've witnessed stuff, people will follow this up. It is outlawed in this country, and we want our international visitors, residents, as especially our European residents and contributors to our society, to feel at home and feel that they're protected. And there is this campaign. And if you don't have it, we can. If you don't know what that is, we can make sure and get it to Nick and we can circulate it around. There is an entire Police Scotland campaign sponsored by the government saying you should not be suffering at the tongue of anybody abuse because of your accent or because of your ethnicity or where you've come from and being here. So
it's probably a minority. I think everybody's had some experiences being in Scotland, probably, but it's what the media used to create that fear into the locals, by using those incidents and propagating that. But I think we all had good experience in Scotland. Fingers crossed nobody needs to use that line.
Yeah, you were waiting?
Yeah, well, what I had to say very much relates to what both of you said, and also to previous points of panelists and various people here. We've been talking a lot about education and the role of education and how important it is, but I just wanted to bring it back to the bigger picture and say that education is not going to solve everything. I think the leadership and the narrative that is coming from the leadership is the most important, because children learn from the world around us, young people learn from the world around us, and the social attitudes are created by the narrative that comes from various sources. And what we see in Scotland is obviously very much different, and the nationalism that we've been talking about earlier is also very unique in Europe. That this sort of nationalism, welcoming nationalism that accepts newcomers and says, well, if you live in Scotland, you are Scottish, and you're very welcome to be here. That's something very much different to what we see that is happening in Europe. And one last point to make, Scotland is very clever in its thinking about migration. Scotland understands its needs in terms of demographic and also the future of its economy and so on. So for them and its future in the European Union if it becomes independent. So it's this narrative is very great if you're a European, but at the same time it's good to understand that there are other reasons behind it, and that this progressive thinking of migration is the only way to go for Scotland.
Yeah, and I mean it's I mean I think you're absolutely right in what you say. Is Scottish nationalism is, and I'm going to try and keep this as neutral as I can. I'm not advocating Scottish independence, not the debate for tonight. But it is a fundamentally different type of nationalism to the type of English nationalism that drove so much of the Brexit vote. Not all of the Brexit vote, but a large part of the Brexit vote, which is an exclusionary, kind of throw up the walls, draw up the drawbridge type nationalism in a way that Scottish nationalism, at least the main thrust of it, isn't. You're right, it is more. I mean, the slogan's been independence in Europe since the 1980s. That's been the whole sort of mantra of the party. But I think the leadership point is the one that troubles me the most, because outside of Scotland, I do think our actual political leadership in Scotland is a class apart from the British political leadership. Leave aside whether I agree with them, I think their ability to narrate a story, their ability to present a narrative is far superior to anything that's going on in Westminster. But that might just be looking good by comparison to something really, really bad, I'm not sure. But the leadership thing really worries me. I can't remember a time in my sort of living memory of someone who was geeky about politics from when I was about 5. I remember Margaret Thatcher leaving Downing Street and being glued to the television. I was a weird kid. And I don't remember a time when the political class was so devoid of talent, basically, and so devoid of leadership, and so unwilling to actually stand up and say, yeah, this is going to be unpopular, but this is what I believe. It seems to just be the rise of the soundbite, Newsnight type politician now, and I don't, I take a Tony Benn, I take a Margaret Thatcher, I just, someone who's got a bit of vision, someone who's got a bit of guts about them, and I don't see it. It really worries me. Sorry, back to the it's weird that you can't see me. Back to the panel. Anything on the last couple of rounds of comments that you have a burning desire to chip in with? Mikhail first.
I'm just going to agree with the education system again, that kids actually are doing pretty fine at assimilating with other kids. It's the grown-ups who didn't tell them at home what is or what is not right. So I think this is the kids in education is not the real deal. It's the grown-ups you have to work with, basically.
I'm conscious that we kept.
Yeah, I was just about to ask you how long you probably need to. It's 9 o'clock. You probably have to leave us.
Yeah, you've probably got some photos to take. Are you done, Mikhail, or?
Am I done?
Or are you wanting to listen in, or what do you want to do? Because we're.
Horrible.
You're okay to stay, yeah?
Yeah, sure. When I need to leave, I'll let you guys know. But
yeah.
And obviously, we're not telling you to leave, given the connotations of the evening and the event. We're not suggesting that for a second. So, I mean, that would just be... Okay, you're staying. You're sticking around. Any on the last few rounds of comments? Was there anything that you wanted?
No, I think the leadership and the example of Scotland in other countries is definitely. It's for me, like, I did a lot of work in Europe, and it's quite like in social enterprise as well. It's quite funny to see how, again, it's yet another sector where Scotland leads the way, and it's quite a it's also how can I say, interested area, like having that vision for the future and saying, I don't know what I wanted to say with that before I lost my track. So
it's 9 o'clock.
I'll take it back. Yeah, it's probably my bedtime for now. I'll take it back.
I'd like to come back again, because I'm not sure. Nothing is static among human being and society. The reason at the moment, I don't know if you have asked or dare to ask, English, real English, with the Englishness, why they could vote for Brexit. Personally, I could say roughly discuss high level, I'm sorry, maybe it's not representative of some other class, people very well educated and having responsibilities. I could say 63 had, all of them said, it's obviously not against Europe. We want to be part of Europe. It's against the government. There is no. All of them feel, on the contrary, they are part of Europe, of the European Union. The thing is, British government, Westminster, is so rigid in some way. Most of them would say it's the only way to make them in trouble. And it's more a revenge against the government to see how they could deal. In any case, that's what they, all of them, I must say, is always against the government, the Tories mostly. By the way, the Tories, it's just a group of 60 Tories who managed to manipulate the countries, I mean UK, to have the Brexit. But they managed easily. Why I heard the Scottish government is intelligent. They know they need immigration. No, they're not intelligent. They're exactly like the English government. In the English government, or I mean the current, I mean the Tories, extreme right-wing Tories, what they say, who are they are going to address? People who say, give me back Britain, England, or the empire. Because they don't need the immigration. They feel they are so strong, so better, so capable to some kind of autarky. They just want to govern the world again. Where in Scotland, on the contrary, they say, no, we are only 5 million. We need good surgeons. We need good mathematicians, physicists. We want to have good pilots and so on. We need more people coming from everywhere. There are some space. It's exactly the same, I would say, logic. But both have a different understanding of what here is their interest. It's just a question of interest. And the problem here, and we could, by the way, about just one thing, one of the
thing and then we'll
top,
see anyone.
top manager
You want people to reply to you,
inside,
so one thing. One more thing for now.
one top of the big, I'm not going to give the name, but in academia, big institution in UK, it's English institution inside some academia here, and they said, I feel ostracized as English because my accent, because I'm just English in Scotland. Then when I say how we could have suffered sometimes, because it's one thing to have the government essentially saying, and that quite intelligently, trying to say, come people, we are honored. But it's just a small fraction of people who say and think that. Most of the less educated or try in some islands and so on, if you are going to be so easily welcome. As tourists, yes. As a worker, not sure.
What Scotland lacks
Just,
is the hard
since
edge
there are
on.
racism
I'm going to say something.
everywhere.
I'm going to say something now. What Scotland just lacks. I mean, there are similarities. The idea that Scotland is this fundamentally different country to the rest of the UK with completely different attitudes, and it's. You hear sometimes you think Scotland was part of Scandinavia or something. It has this fundamentally different outlook. It's not. I mean, I know it's not. I know. I'm saying I agree with you. It's not going to happen because we don't have this. Public attitudes in Scotland are not seismically different to public attitudes south of the border. It would be a bit weird if they were, given that we are part of one country and part of, at least for the moment, beyond that one sort of union. But there are subtle differences. There's 5 or so points difference in terms of negative, positive attitudes towards migration in Scotland versus the rest of the UK. When you actually looked at the measures of Euroscepticism in Scotland before the referendum, they were actually broadly similar to in England, but they didn't have the hard edges. So if you ask people in Scotland, do you think the European Union's too powerful and needs to be, its wings need to be clipped? The same percentage of people in Scotland would basically say yes to that as in England, but then when you make it a binary choice between stay in and leave, far fewer people in Scotland then tip over the edge and go into that sort of harder extreme, yes, let's get out, let's Brexit. More likely to just say, well, yeah, we don't like it, but we'll stay in it, because it's different interests, they have a different understanding of their interests. And it's similar with immigration, and that's what opens the door for the Scottish Government to be able to publicly advocate for higher immigration to Scotland. You're not going to hear a British Prime Minister say that anytime soon. Partially it's because we economically need it, but it's also because Scotland doesn't have anything like UKIP, and has never looked likely to have anything like UKIP, because it doesn't have that hard-edged form of nationalism that we have in England. And we can't just keep saying it's terrible English nationalism, it's terrible. It is, I don't like it either, but it's not going anywhere. And we're not going to tackle it by just saying people shouldn't think that way. We've got to figure out what the grievances are, and it seems to be driven, all of the survey data suggests that that form of English nationalism is driven by insecurity, basically. It's cultural and it's economic insecurity. And you either fix that, and that might change people's attitudes, or you continue to ignore it, but accept that every now and then those people en masse are going to give us a collective kick up the arse that we don't like they did in 2016. And that's the choice. Yeah, and then
Trying to make a comment for last 20 minutes.
You got to wave at me if it's
So
you got to wave at me.
it was very short comment I was planning to make. That we all have emotions. Everyone was talking so much about emotions, and you all got emotions. The problem is not in emotions, but the actions of those emotions. What actions actions that eradicate from the emotions. And to be honest, sitting in this audience, I feel this is the most racist audience I've sat on, in the last, I don't know, forever probably. Everyone is talking about English this, English that, and wow. Seriously, come on.
So how do we talk about a phenomenon that's actually there in English political? How do we talk about it if we can't describe what it is?
Because it is extreme right wing.
I think we can speak about England as because as you stated, just few people, few Tories, got certain attitude. It's only 5 million people in Scotland and 60 million people in the United Kingdom, and what attitude do we refer about when you're talking about nationalism and dislikeness about foreigners? And different people have different moments in their life, and different age have totally different opinions about things. It's like, I was, the reason I asked about homelessness, because I was homeless. And I wasn't homeless because I'm from a poor family and no one to look after me, and it was, I was very young, and very stubborn. So it's like I've chosen rather to be homeless rather than go and ask for help. And that makes sense, So and then I would do more mistakes and more problems would be created from that, and I would think that the whole world around me is against me at some point, And that didn't change. In fact, for a long time, I don't know, is it my ADHD or, but when I had children, and my first child.
Oh, who's waving?
He's gonna have to go now.
Oh, you have to go.
Oh.
Sorry.
Sorry, I didn't want to be rude, but I need to.
Well, too late you have been.
Sorry.
We're going to talk about you once you've gone now, that's it.
Michael, thanks
Thank
very
you
much.
so
Yeah,
much.
from
Thank
Nick,
you so
yeah?
much.
And thanks, Michael. Could you?
And lovely to meet you all. For the good night.
Yeah, good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Night, night, night.
That's the problem having you back
Could
to
you
the
put
screen. Yeah. Oh, well, he's disconnected us.
That's fine.
That's fine, isn't
That's
it? That's okay. Your hand was up. Was it still up or?
Yeah.
Was it? I mean, no, it's not literally, but it was a minute ago. So yeah.
Like I wanted to bounce back about what you were saying, which I found really interesting because you talk about national insecurity, you talk about immigration, like if it was the main purpose of English voting for Brexit, which to me is a fake issue. You know, coming from France, every time I come back to France, the immigration feel like a much more significant problem that it is in Great Britain, living on an island. The argument that I had for English voting for Brexit, and I'm quoting, you know, Le Monde, like French newspaper, like the main argument would be the economical argument, and the most famous example we could serve was, for instance, that British family in the UK who is running a family-run business making jam, and that the EU governing high up from Belgium, Brussels, we declare that jam is not, as per the regulation, must not be called jam anymore because it's got 12% sugar instead of 11% sugar, making that whole family fail and have to, close the business. And this was this kind of stories that fed the argument of English voting in favor of leaving the EU. And for me, like as the silly French girl coming to Scotland, I'm thinking, oh, but they have reason to vote for Brexit. This is like what I explained earlier. This is why I didn't feel the right to pretend that I had a say in voting for or against Brexit, which I found interesting to everything you said.
I mean, not everyone who voted for Brexit was driven by concerns about immigration. It was one of the major determining factors in the vote, and the correlation between attitudes towards immigration and likelihood to vote to leave in the referendum is very, very high. But it's not the single determining factor. There's, we want to think about a Jacob Rees-Mogg style Brexit versus a Nigel Farage type of Brexit. That sort of that's kind of tapping back into something that you were saying earlier. This sort of romanticised idea of what England or Britain was when it had its empire pre-Europe and so on. They've created for years this sort of image that Britain is oppressed somehow by Europe. It's a very funny sort of oppression that you can't sell prawn cocktail crisps and call them crisps, or you can't make jam unless you have a certain amount of sugar. It's a very strange form of oppression. I think it's misuse of the word oppression, really.
Do you think it's valuable? Do you think it's legit, or is
do I think it's?
Do you think it's actually true, legit? Like, do you think it's a real argument? Or do you think it's an excuse to?
Oh, I see what you mean. Well, no, I mean, I don't know every single person who voted Brexit, but I think, again, if you look at the data, I don't think people were voting Brexit because of one specific issue about like one quirky EU regulation, but that goes into a broader story, it goes into a broader narrative about the European Union being able to direct and micromanage our lives in all sorts of weird ways that we're not comfortable with, a lot of which are often just not true, they're just inaccurate. The curvature banana one is the most common one. It's just rubbish, it's nonsense. But you constantly get these weird stories in papers that are read by millions of people up and down the country every day, like The Sun and like The Mail. The Express isn't read by millions of people, but it's read by quite a lot. So I think it's not that it's specifically someone's got an issue with EU jam regulation or EU sugar regulation or EU mobile. It's that all of those things combined tap into a broader narrative that's been taking root for decades in British political discourse, which is the European Union has too much interference in our lives and we need to, what was the line? Take back control. And for some people, the immigration thing went straight in with that too, because, well, we can't control our borders either. Not only are they regulating our jam, they're also telling us we can't tell us who can come into the country and on what terms. But there was then another driver around the immigration thing, which I think was quite separate to the sovereignty type argument. It was a reaction to cultural, demographic, economic change on the ground. I mean, I don't know how often people go down to the north of England, to places like Bolton or Stockport or Bury or Oldham. There's nothing there. There's just nothing. And it's no good to then, as political class, say to these people, oh, don't vote for Brexit because you think of what you'll lose. Because their answer is, well, we've got nothing, so we've got nothing to lose. And that is fair. Because that is the lived experience of the people who aren't in this room right now, who live in lots of places around the northwest in particular, former mining towns in Wales. That's their lived experience. And the problem is they never speak to you, and possibly you never speak to them. And that's back to this whole, building bridges. Sorry, you've been trying to say something about 5 minutes, I apologise.
Coming from Sweden,
Yeah.
even though I lived there for a very long time, the problem is that Sweden decided some years ago that we will take control of the borders, right? And they just did it, EU said whatever they said, they did it the same way. They just did it because they needed to. And UK can do the same way. It seemed to be that the United Kingdom have this, whatever printed in the black and white in the paper, maybe be on a iPad, whatever printed media they have, they will follow to 100% regulations. But the rest of the EU decides to have this interpretation of the letter of the law and make what's best for their own countries. And that's why I think the Moggs, Theresa Mogg, Boris Johnson, these people actually played up a big part of making hysteria amongst the, I wouldn't call them less educated, but less people who maybe just read certain type of tabloids, papers to get the views on Brexit. That's what happened.
Yeah.
Because 2015 Sweden said we cannot cope, shut the borders, end of. And that still is in place.
Yeah.
So why couldn't United Kingdom do the same?
Well, that was a Schengen issue, and we're not in Schengen.
No, you're not in Schengen.
So, okay, so that wasn't around the migration up through the south of.
Sweden is we are in Schengen, but we have stopped the borders anyway.
Yeah, no, I'm saying that was a Schengen issue. We're not in Schengen.
No,
Does anyone know?
But that was a border issue. I don't know how technical we're going to get into. That was a border check issue in an area that has like literally no border. I mean, the UK isn't in Schengen, so in the same, you'll have all noticed, I'm sure, when you fly back to the UK, you go through passport control. You go from Germany to France. You don't, or you shouldn't. Maybe you do. Because that's because they're in Schengen. So the deal around that was. Multiple European Union countries said, after Merkel basically said, come one, come all, they said, well, Schengen won't work on that basis because we're creating migration routes here from the south of Africa right the way up, so we're reimposing border checks on people's passports. What Sweden didn't do was interfere in any way, shape or form with the four freedoms of movement within the EU, which is what the issue in this country has been, not Schengen because we're not in it.
Yeah, but that's what I was sold to the United Kingdom population. This is what you have to do, because if you don't get back to control the borders, EU will regulate it whatever you want to do.
And we could do other things. I mean, there's ways domestically you could change laws. One of the things is something around contribution-based benefit systems. One of the reasons that European Union countries are often able to stop this benefit tourism that people claim to exist but doesn't really, is because they can link it to contributions, and we can't do that because we don't have a contribution system.
It's not just about immigration; it's about other things in life. That you said the banana has to be curved. That doesn't really apply, right? Cucumber has to be straight. Right. But for some reason, people in this country seems to believe that is the rule of law. Yeah. Well, what do they get that information from? The rest
But that's
of Europe
controlling.
I've got just so many hands. Oh, I'm losing control. I need to take back control. Because you have your hand up and you have your hand up. No, the gentleman next to you has his hand up, and yeah. So I also got my eye on the clock as well. So can we go to you? Then can we come back across, and then we're going to have to start wrapping up, I'm afraid.
I'll be very short. As a person, I come from Iceland, and as being a country that is not in the EU, but in the EU, the European Economic Area, as well as Schengen, as a tax-paying recipient of a national insurance number in Scotland, I have literally no idea what is happening to me in the next couple of months. Even talking to people who are like recipients of other nationalities, they are EU citizens, and they know they might be kicked out, they might not be kicked out, and the problem is that even our own government doesn't even know what's going to happen to us.
No, if you go onto the gov. I did it today just to check before this event. If you go onto the UK government website, and it'll give everybody here who's in EU 27 information about settled status. There's a little box in grey, and it says people in the UK from Iceland, Liechtenstein, Switzerland, and Norway we're still trying to decide what to do with you. Like, I'm not even, that's basically, that's what it says. I'm not even paraphrasing, that is what it says. It's one sentence. And that's because there are negotiations going on in parallel. Everyone always focuses on the UK-EU negotiation, but there is negotiations in parallel with the EAA too, because they negotiate separately, but no one talks about that because it's three countries that we forget are there. And it's,
there's a fourth separate trade negotiation.
Of course there is. Of course there is.
Because Iceland has always, since 1945, has had a free trade negotiation with the kingdom.
Yeah.
With the kingdom. Yeah. Since we allowed you guys to, kind of come over before the. Since we allowed the Union to, invade us before during the wars. Since then, there's been a free trade agreement that has legally, I think, surpassed all other, may or may not have surpassed all other trade negotiations. But as of, all of this confusion, like there are at least, I think, 60 plus people, at least in Edinburgh.
From Iceland?
Yeah, in Edinburgh and Glasgow. And we have no idea what's happening.
No, it's terrible.
Yeah.
But you're right. Yeah, you're right. And the UK government doesn't seem to either. Okay, so no pressure. Last comment.
Okay.
Just a little point. So did you notice in the budget, in Hammond's budget, that EU citizens, Americans, Canadians, blah, 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 will be allowed to go through the passport, the automatic passport? Did you notice that slipped into the budget? Wonder why?
Still is.
So you'll be able to go through the passport control at Edinburgh Airport in Britain. I wonder why. I think they're setting the paving for something else. That just chimed with me. Why are they actually doing that? Another little point. Yes, back to the gentleman who was talking. The rule about, as you say, sort of social tourism. And I always said to folk, I always said to people, why would a Polish worker, why would you come all the way to Britain if you could do the same thing, just go across to Germany and be a frontier worker? Why would you come all the way here to do that if it was so easy? It was an absolute will of Britain to have, as you said, it was our policy to allow people to come here. Come here because we need manpower and labour. And it was the biggest lie, actually, of the Brexiters. And back to Cyril's point, it is those 63 or 64 extreme right guys that use that through the right-wing press in Britain, which is the tabloid press. But a little bit of hope as well. This has been published in the New Statesman. Well, I think watch the Hammond thing. What the hell is that about? What have they done? They've actually put in a piece in the budget. We can scan this and set it as the New Statesman, Solving UK's Productivity Puzzle. You read this, it's in New Statesman. There's also a fantastic about the Brexit crash. It's going to be worse. That's why I jumped.
You said it was a positive note to finish on. No crashes. Come on now. Stick with the productivity.
It is. The productivity is that there are 9 million adults in the UK who lack basic numeracy and literacy, and that the UK has 20% less productive than leading global economies. The average of the US, France and Germany workers produces 4 days what it would take an average British worker 5 days to do. Yeah. And back to Cyril's point as well, it's actually, when you read it, it's because our people are so depressed. We're so demotivated and so depressed because of the policy. Nobody's had a pay rise, nobody's incentive to actually do better. And we need to, so there's, I think this is starting to bubble to the surface in the UK government, and I think the Brexiteers, and it's seen as a big deciding point when they actually start to vote on, will we leave and crash out without any deal the way we want? And I think there's some really good press going on. That's what I'm saying. I would suggest you get the New Statesman. I'll get to whoever's organising this and give you the reference if you want to go and read some of these articles that are in the New Statesman.
You can get 6 free articles online, I think, a week or something with the New Statesman. So you can try it out before you subscribe to it. But I think we'll get.
That was a positive note, actually.
Absolutely.
I think this stuff is now coming home to roost.
And just to briefly close, I'm going to abuse my position as the briefly, and it backs up exactly that, because the Migration Advisory Committee, which is something the government has set up, where it's staffed by literally the people who fed into this new report are the top minds in the country who work on migration, and they finally, based on purely UK evidence, produced a fantastic report. It only came out the other week, and the conclusions were very clear, which was, and I am reading them direct: immigration makes the UK more productive, which is exactly to your point, benefits the Treasury, and those positive effects far more than enough to outweigh any small direct negative impacts on wages for lower paid workers, which is still some debate about what the effect is. But we don't do evidence-based immigration policy in this country, but I think after Brexit we're going to have to start doing it, because we're going, as you were saying, we're going to have shortages, we lack productivity, we lack skills. The very final positive thing I would say is, just because you know, we're talking about community as well tonight, just remember that when we go out on the street, this is a very placative thing to finish on, you know, for every 10 people that you pass on a street in Edinburgh, probably 7 or 8 of them voted to remain. This city did vote 74% to stay in the EU, so if that helps to make people, at least in their immediate locality, think like they're amongst friends, then that's the positive note I would finish on. Nick?
I was just going to say, if you feel insecure, really insecure, write an email to your MSP. And I would write even to Ben McPherson, who's an extremely amenable guy. And I think that's the beauty of the Scottish Government as well, is that it is very open. You can send emails and you do get replies. I mean, try doing that with Wensford, you don't get it. So write your email, write it in your own language, write to them, and they do come back to you and ask if you ask to meet them. Go and meet them. Why not?
Right, everybody.
So, quick hands up and down question.
Yes.
So
we've lost control.
presumably-
We've totally lost control.
I've lost control. Sorry, one question.
Presumably we all will need visa. And how many of you,
No.
how many of you would come back to Scotland if you would need to get a visa?
I live here, so obviously that's a good choice.
There you go. Everybody. Right. So, first of all, you can continue that out in the drinks if you want to continue with the drinks. Thank you everybody for coming, and it was fascinating to hear Iceland's calling in there. It's like the Eurovision Song Contest.
I know.
I'm kind of calling in there. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks to Michael, obviously, and if you haven't seen his exhibition of photographs, you really should check out his exhibition of photographs. He's got them online. He's also got an incredible video of his grandfather's journey. He retraced his grandfather's journey in the Second World War and the forests that he hid in as a Polish soldier, etc. So have a look at that. Obviously, my friend Zakia, you know, for me, an incredible woman. She knows how much I care about homelessness and the issue. I think it's wrong. I think it's getting worse. And you know, people like Zakia, who you know comes from France but is helping you know people on the streets of Scotland, you know, gets my absolute respect. So you know, I'm really grateful for all your input tonight. So that was amazing. And obviously, I'd like to thank Product Forge for live streaming, and you know, guys did a great job. Alex, thanks very much, mate. And obviously, your man Dan here did a great job keeping it all together. I know it's quite an emotional subject. We wanted to run it because we wanted to get a different view than a political view, and I think we got tons of material. And obviously there was tons of emotion, and we can't hide that, I'm afraid. We're all emotional people. But I just want to thank you all, but especially I want to thank Dan for keeping it all together. Dan. Thank you. Thanks, guys. Thanks for that.
You need, well,
Taking the pen.
in UK you don't stop to